Good morning. So good to see you all. Once more, welcome to the services of the Parish Church of Christ. We are so glad you're here on this first day of the week, the Lord's Day, to worship Him. Thank you, Henry, for leading those songs, and Russ for that reading and prayer. So appreciative of everyone and their participation in our worship service. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to John chapter 13, and in just a few moments we'll be reading from that text. John chapter 13, as we continue our series that we began a couple of months ago now, Becoming You, Daily Spiritual Training. In this series we are talking about spiritual disciplines. What is a spiritual discipline? It is a tool by which we become more like Christ, and therefore more like the people that God has created us to be. And the way that we can become more like Christ, and the way that we can identify these tools or these disciplines, is by examining the life and the teaching of Christ and putting His life and His teaching into practice in our lives. And so we've looked at a number of different disciplines that help us to become more like Christ, but they are tools. They are not products. They are tools that help us become. And so the goal is not the tool, it is the becoming. And today, the tool that we're looking at, the discipline that we're considering, is submission. Now that's a bad word in our society, submission. Our culture has a bad taste in its mouth when it comes to the idea of submission. And I think that there are a number of possible reasons for this. One is many people simply do not understand what submission is. The world has taught them that submission means someone gets to lord it over you, and you have to do whatever they say without question. And so, who wants a part of something like that? But another reason that submission is not accepted in our society is that some reject all forms of authority, no matter if that authority is appropriate or handled in the best possible way. And ultimately, that is a rejection of God. Because if there is no authority over me, then there is no being over me. And so as we think about submission and its directly related brother service or servanthood today, I hope that we can see the picture that God would like us to have of this very special and important discipline. Because I think if we could sum up the life of Jesus while He was on earth, if we think about that reading that Russ gave to us from Philippians chapter 2, and we think about the life of Jesus, we could sum it up in these two words: submission and servanthood. And the passage that we're looking at together this morning from John chapter 13 is a living image of just that. And so the goal this morning is to notice three verbs, three action words that together build the life of service through submission. And so first we notice love. As we open up to John chapter 13 and we begin our reading, the beloved disciple John is writing the events of the final Passover that Jesus shared with His disciples. According to John, Jesus' ministry lasted 3 years, and so we can say pretty safely that this is probably, if not the second, then the third time that He has shared this meal with His disciples. But it is the last time. And as John sets the scene for us, he prepares our minds for the things that are to follow. by describing what is taking place. He says in John chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, "Now, before the feast of the Passover." Before the feast of the Passover. Now, what we must understand is that, in fact, because of the way that things are going to play out over the next several days, Jesus and his disciples actually partake of this special meal together a little bit early. And so John says it's before the feast of the Passover, the most important holy day in the common Jewish mind, the Passover, because of what it represented to the children of Israel, those we call Jews. It represented for them freedom from bondage. You may recall last week, as we were noticing the life of Moses and his mother Jochebed, that Moses would eventually be the one to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt and toward the promised land of God, Canaan. But in the meantime, the people of God suffered greatly under a yoke of slavery. And the Passover celebration represented freedom. Freedom from that slavery, that bondage, but also the everlasting love of God for his people. Because in that Passover, there was the sacrifice by family unit and the blood placed above the door. And when the angel of God passed by, when he saw that blood on the post, he knew that there were the people of God. And John says, this is the time. As the Jews are thinking about and remembering the most important event in their history, it is this time when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. We talked a few weeks ago about the meaning of his hour in John. It anticipates the cross. Now, I want you to put that together because his hour had come. The cross was upon him. And just as the blood above the doorpost identified the people of God, Jesus on the cross says, this world belongs to you, God. These are your people. And so, what does John say? He loved his own. Who are his own? The people to whom he had been sent. Was he sent to only the faithful? No. He said, I came for the sinners. He loved them, and John says, he loved them to the end. Now, in the original language, that little phrase, just two words, could mean either to the end of time, that is, for as long as he had been with them, or it could mean to the end of the earth, we would say, the ends of the earth, to the uttermost. And perhaps the meaning is both, that Jesus loved them as long as he could possibly love them, and as much as he could possibly love them. He loved them to the end. And it is this setting that helps us to understand everything else that John will describe. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. I want you to think about this setting for a moment. John has already said, it is in this time when the Jews are thinking about this very important event in their history. It is in the time that Jesus knows that he has done what he has been sent to do, that he has loved the people as much as he could love them. But it is also in this time when he knows that he's going to be betrayed. And look around the table. Knowing all of this, there is Peter, who will deny him 3 times. There is Thomas, who will doubt his resurrection. There is the group who will all desert him. And there, Judas, who will betray him. And he takes the basin and he pours the water and he wraps himself in a towel. Knowing all this, because he loved them. Knowing all this, he humiliates himself. The God who spoke creation into existence, what does John say? He knew that he had come from God. The God who spoke the creation into existence took off his outer garment and got on his knees to wash smelly feet. And it was only love that put him on the floor. The very same love that sent him to the cross. See how he loved them. See how he loves you and how he loves me. You can have service without love, but you cannot have love without service. Love finds the necessary tools to do the job, and love does the job. Not because it is required, but because love says, no matter how small the task, I am big enough to do it for you. Because pride makes little people. But humility says, I am big enough to do whatever must be done. To wash feet. To die on a cross. Love is a key to submission and service. He continues around the table. We can only imagine what the scene was like. The disciples understood who, to a degree anyway, who he was. And in their cultural setting, Jesus was the host of this very special meal. The closest thing we might be able to think about would be gathering around the table at Thanksgiving or Christmas with all of the family there, and the head of the house begins to undress in front of everyone. And you can imagine that the disciples were probably shocked at this. Here is the master, the host, and he is washing feet. And I think the only sound in that room must have been the rustle of the rag and the dipping in the water basin as Jesus, one by one, washed their dirty, smelly feet. Until, of course, he came to Peter, who said, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, "Not all of you are clean." Peter pushes back. He refuses the Lord's service. "Oh no, you're the master. You are the host. It is perfectly acceptable for you, Lord, to provide the meal, to sit at the head of the table, but it is not right for you to wash my feet." And look at what Peter almost misses. Because Jesus says, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Communion, fellowship, brotherhood depends on our ability to submit to one another. Because Jesus had already humiliated himself. He had already shown a form of submission, of humility, in getting down on his hands and knees to wash their feet, but Peter would not submit. Now that's a little bit of a reversal, isn't it? You don't think of the one who's being served as the one who submits, but in fact, that was what it took. Mutual submission. Notice what Paul says. I don't have it on the screen. In Ephesians chapter 5, beginning at verse 1, he says that, "Therefore," based on everything he's already said in this book, "be imitators of God." And verse 2, what does that look like? Walk in love. And the end of the section, verse 21, "Therefore, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ." Love means we submit to each other. And it means we've got to give up our pride. Because it was pride, not pride in Jesus, that kept Peter initially from having his feet washed, but his own pride. The thought that if I were the master, I would never wash feet, so why is Jesus washing my feet? Oh, but humility says we submit to one another. Out of love, we deny ourselves, and therefore we are free. We are free to serve one another. Richard Foster says, "Submission frees us to lay down the terrible burden of always needing to get our own way." Do you know somebody who has to have their way all the time? They are miserable people. It's an awful burden to have your way all the time, because you're constantly going to be disappointed by other people. And your happiness depends on things you can't control. And the person who has to have their way is constantly breaking up relationships. They have broken family relationships. They split churches over the silliest things. And all along, they're burdened. They're miserable because they haven't learned that true freedom comes not from getting your way, but not needing to have it in the first place. Submission is freedom. Freedom to serve others. Freedom to love as He first loved us. And then notice what happens as Jesus brings the lesson home. When He had washed their feet and put on His outer garments and resumed His place, He said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you?" Now, Jesus is a master teacher. And you're going to see in the next several verses several different ways all at once that He teaches the disciples how to understand, how to live what He has just told them. He begins with this rhetorical question, "Do you understand what I have done to you?" And then He says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then," oh, here it is, "if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." He starts with a rhetorical question. He meets them in common ground in verse 13. You know who I am. Therefore, knowing who I am, this is what you should do. I've given you the example. And then verse 16, he states a truth that they had known all of their lives. A servant is not greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And what's the implication? If I'm your master, if I'm your teacher, if you're my students, if you're my servants, and I have done this, then how much more should you? Verse 17, if you know these things, blessed are you. If you know these things, blessed are you. No. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. The blessing doesn't come from the understanding. That's the easy part. That's not too difficult. The blessing comes from the doing. The understanding becomes the application. The knowledge becomes the attitude and the action. And so that means that we live this life of love and submission, and service is not a momentary action, but it is our way of life. It touches everything we do. The home, the church, the community. You know, just one example. Think about worship. I know, I'm the preacher, but I've listened to many sermons. I know there are times when the preacher stands up and he says, here's going to be today's text or topic. And you say, well, what does that have to do with me? But the life of submission says, my neighbor, I don't know my neighbor's needs particularly maybe, but maybe my neighbor needs this. Do you know when the sermon touches my neighbor's needs, it's touching my needs as well? If I'm living and loving and submitting? This is exactly what Thomas Long says. Sometimes hearing the gospel actually means overhearing the gospel being spoken directly to others whose circumstances are unlike our own. Because I understand uniquely that the cross is the greatest act of humility and submission, and that if I'm bearing the cross, if I'm denying self, and if my neighbor's needs are being met, then my needs are being met as well, because I am living like my Savior. What need did Jesus have to wash the disciples' feet? He needed to wash their feet because their feet needed to be washed. His neighbor's needs became his own. Submission touches every aspect of life. We submit to the Word of God and therefore to God Himself. We submit to our parents, to our employers, to our spouse, to our neighbors, to one another. It's not submission and servanthood because I have to, but because I am free to. Jesus showed us the way. Washing the disciples' feet was simply an illustration of the new Passover, where He would die, where He would place the blood on the doorframe of mankind, so that all can say, we have a share in the Lord if we accept the offer of Christ. Submission is a bad word in our society, but maybe it's misunderstood. It's not about one lording it over another, but about freely giving up my rights, my wants, and my needs, because out of love, I would like to see them met in the life of my neighbor. And there is no greater illustration of that, no greater presence of that truth than in the embodiment of Jesus Christ. And so, how do we learn to submit? By learning to serve with joy. And so your challenge this week is to find an opportunity to serve. I know many of you serve in many ways already. Do that thing that you couldn't possibly imagine doing to serve someone else. Do that thing that, surely that's for someone else. And as you do it, think about the love that Christ had for you, and about the freedom that comes from giving up self in order to be like Christ. Becoming you. God made us to bear the image of His glory. And as we live like Christ, His glory shines. Maybe you need this morning to put on Christ. You've not yet died to self, but you believe that He is the Messiah, the promised one of Scripture, and you're willing to turn away from your life of sin and confess His name. We'll be glad to baptize you. That blood that He shed will cover you and wash you, and you will rise a new creature in Christ, ready to serve. Or if you're a child of God and you need the prayers of this church, or you need to confess some sin so that we might build you up and encourage you and God might forgive you, you're welcome to come also as we stand and sing together.